briefly of great interest to philosophy, analytical philosophy of science, which is this very simple thing about common salt. So common salt is a salt we all eat every day, and you know the salt has certain properties like dissolving in water, it is salty in taste. But common salt, which you would have learnt in school, is made up of sodium and chlorine. So it's NaCl is its chemical compound. One sodium atom and one chlorine atom supposedly gives you one molecule of common salt. Now, what is very interesting discussion in philosophy of science is, how is it that given sodium with its properties, given chlorine with its properties, you can never, given all that we know about them in today's chemistry, you can never predict the property of NaCl. That is, when things come together, they always create more than the properties of the parts. This idea, which has again become extremely popular in philosophy, for example, which has become very popular in philosophy because of the idea of emergent properties. That is, when things come together, new properties emerge, which is not there in the earlier things. And this idea of emergence is also very of great interest to the social. So if the social is a mix of 20, 30 people, does that mix create something more than just an addition of these 20, 30 individuals? And you know, that kind of questions, it becomes extremely important. And so Aparna is not talking about that. He's only talking about a very simple observation that the idea of, if you want to have a concept of minority, you have to have a concept of majority. In fact, he'll go to the extent to say that majority cannot be defined without first invoking an idea of minority. Because minority sustains the very idea of majority. And the question, both minority and majority are doing the very similar things. They are trying to understand how is we formed? How is this belongingness to some group which is being formed? And what he suggests is that in the context of the majority, he has, I think earlier he had formulated this idea of what he called predatory identities. That is, identities which are formed by groups, especially in the context of majority. These identities are constructed, and as part of their constructions, they require eradication of others who come in the way of the formation of the we. So let me put it this way, explain this. So suppose, 50 of us in this room decide that we will all be members now, or form a community of Shamir Foundation, let us say. And the predatory identities is that those groups which will not let you form this identity as this we, then they have to be eliminated. Eliminated is a very strong word, but he talks about it in terms of extincting, making them extinct, in order for us this we to be formed. And I think it's just a simple social process where if you want to form a group, let us say, and somebody is an obstacle to that group, you want to remove that obstacle in order to create that group. So this is in the context of we formation, a social formation, how all of us come together under one heading. It could be any kind of heading which is called a minority. But to do that, you construct an identity, that predatory identity, in order to remove those other communities which do not let you come together. So what he's trying to suggest, that the minority is seen now as a threat at two levels. So the question of minority is not a threat because of numbers. Numbers is the least important problem of a threat of minorities. Okay, and of course in globalization he raises points to another possible problem with that. But we can assume that minorities by numbers are not a threat to the majority. But minorities as an idea, as an obstacle in this particular sense, is a threat. And what does he mean by that? This is a point which he makes, which I really have a problem with, and I don't agree with it, but for completeness I should say that. Because he says the threat of minority arises when they are seen as obstacles to the achievement of purity of the majority. So the way in which the minority now plays out is to say, well, there is a group which we call the majority. We are all coming together as some we formation, social formation. And the idea of minority are those obstacles which are not letting us achieve the purity of the majority. That is, if all of us come together under that idea, right? Let us say we are all secularists and want to come together under the idea of secular, community of secularists, which is a minority in India anyway. If you look at that and then you ask, what is it that is not allowing that to happen? What is coming in the way of that happening? Then you look at these people who are, the purity of this idea of the secular we is contaminated by those who are not. And so what he is suggesting is that the majority's reaction to minority is based on the fact the minority contaminates the purity of the majority. Okay, there are a lot of very problematical assumptions about purity and so on. I'm not going to defend that argument at all, because and it's a very important argument for him, because he says therefore the majority will undertake violence towards the minority in order to purify themselves. I think there are some parts which you might sympathize with, because if we look at most of the ways in which the discourses on riots and so on, there is often these questions about riots, etc., invoke the question of purity. It's quite shocking. And I think he's drawing perhaps non-substantially from it, but an idea to say that, look, there is this notion of the purity which is being violated by the existence of the minority, and I have to violently purify by exterminating. Now, whether you accept that particular value or not, I think this question of the majority tension through these processes is very important. But he also points to something else which is very interesting, which is he points out that minority earlier in the early Western liberal tradition had a very positive value. In fact, even today we follow that rule in Supreme Court and High Court and so on, which is the minority opinion. The question of minority, the positive value of minority comes from dissent. And to me, that is the most crucial idea of minority I want to hold on to. Minority opinion is that opinion which a judge will write even when that judge is on the losing side of the votes cast for the judgment. So, as I'm sure many of you know, suppose there are it's a three-bench court and there are three judges, and two of them say that, judgment in one thing, and the one third judge dissents against it. Now, the judgment will be given not entirely in the majority view of the problem. The minority report or the minority judgment will be appended. In fact, one of the most important studies in judicial sciences, or the study of jurisprudence and so on, is the study of minority reports. The first thing which you train a law student to do is to go look at these minority judgments, not the majority ones. The majority ones are already there. And that practice of having a minority have their say is a very important positive idea of minority, because in the opinion, in the distribution of opinions, the belief that minority opinion is what allows public dissent and possible debate. And that question of this minority opinion within societies becomes a deeply troubling question when we talk about social and cultural communities, not judicial communities. That is, if I can have a minority opinion respected on par with the majority judgment of a bench, Supreme Court bench, then how do you get minority opinion or minority communities on par with the majority opinions and beliefs of the majority community? That positive value which he sees earlier in Western liberal thing is a question which will allow us to bring it to the contemporary question about what we need to do, because the question of minority opinion is about procedural dissent, how to dissent. And to me, if there is anything which the Delhi government should be told today, is just that. How do you understand dissent? Nothing else. You don't have to understand, what is right. We are not talking about right and wrong. How do you understand if I do not believe in the worldview of yours? How do we publicly talk about it? How do we publicly engage with each other when I disagree with each other? In fact, the question of dissent, the question of, managing dissent, becomes one of the most, not just the important social problems, but one of the most deep-rooted institutional problems. How do we disagree and yet continue to be the we? I hope you see the point. The question of dissent is very important for the problem of the we. So I have to be able to dissent with my colleagues, and yet we will have to be colleagues. How is that possible? What is the mechanism by which dissent does not break up the we sense, the we community? And that's really and in fact, I would interpret this idea to extend it further and say it's a question of minority dissent which provides the glue for the majority we. Otherwise, you won't have a group of majority B. The majority, as we will see very soon, is very unstable and has a tendency to break up. And that's, I think that's a point which, to me at least, is very important. And then finally, he ends with, he discusses the Muslim case in India, but in order to point out that the real deep problem about the question of minority today is a link between globalization and minority. And in the case of the Muslim example in India, he points out how the fact that the threat of the Muslim minority arises because through a construction of a global Muslim, not of the Muslim minority, of the minority within the nation, but the fact that the minority of the Muslims is always connected to a pan-Islam, pan-global issue of Muslim. And along with the fact that globalization has challenged the fundamental ideas of nation-state due to migrations. I mean, today, if you really ask the question in the context of India, who is running India? Or who is influencing very deeply questions of this notions of India? As I'm sure many of you know, there are people sitting in the US and UK who probably have greater say on this imagination of India than all of us sitting here. So this that changes the very idea of how one imagines a nation state, how globalization is contributing to this violence vis-a-vis the minorities. Now, I want to therefore look at this as a starting point and then unpack the different meanings and then, look at the different kinds of what you would call as a semantic valences, the different kinds of meaning which a word like minority or a concept like minority can pick up. And through that, hopefully show you how this question of majority-minority plays out in different contexts. Whenever we use these terms, how they actually come up with different meanings. So I'm going to break them up in the following manner. I want to look at the meanings of the minority and the idea of minority-majority in different domains. So I will begin with, I'll begin with the questions of the meaning of minority as numbers, connected to the question of numbers. Then as quality. There is something very, very important about an idea of being a minority which is not captured by the of numbers. One way to talk about it is as an experience. What does it constitute to be a minority? What is the experience of the minority? Or we can re-look at it in terms of what I would call as quality here, and I'll tell you what I mean by it. Then the third one is minority as values, and fourth is minority as cognitive, and fifth is minority as discourse, and finally I'll end with the logic of minority. So what I'm showing with these 6 points is to say that the simple term minority can pick up very different meanings when you look at them. Minority as numbers, values, qualities, cognitive states, etc., etc. So I'll just try and indicate very simply what this is, and if there are any questions we can talk about it later. The first part about the majority-minority. So I want to split the majority-minority in this form. Majority, large numbers, minority, small numbers. We can begin with that particular proposition. And then look at this larger question. What is the problem then if I look at large numbers and small numbers? One of the most, this I want to connect to the question of social science. How do we study societies? And that's an extremely important problem for us, right? How do we make sense of a society? And if the minority-majority experience is a part of society, what is the way we really make sense of it? Now, if you look at the shift in sociology, or study social sciences, or the scientific study of society, then you see the shift towards numbers and statistics is a very important core of doing sociology. In fact, in India, very often the claim that Indian sociology is nothing but social anthropology is very often a reflection of the fact that sociology, for example, in let's say the US universities today, are completely statistical. So the anthropologists are a group who do what we call as sociology, and the sociologists do very deeply statistical methods. That's the reason why sociological methods, etc., become so popular in various ways. Now, what is this interesting way of looking at society through numbers? There is something which is very important about numbers, and this relationship between numbers and study of societies itself is very fascinating for those of you who are interested in that discipline. But I want to ask you the question, what is it about numbers and study of society? What is the correlation between them? The reason why statistics becomes very important to study of society is because of 2 things. One, numbers have a pattern. Individuals don't have. The moment I map society, first of all, the idea of the society is already the idea of the many. And the question is, how do I grapple with the many? What are my tools to make sense of the many? Numbers do when I use numbers to talk about the many, there's a very fascinating thing about the very philosophy of numbers, the very nature of numbers, which is that statistics itself, which is called as the law of the many, it's about the discovery of the law of the many, is that through the idea of statistics, I discover patterns about society. So, this is quite fascinating because you can say things about social processes and social formation by just looking at it as looking at patterns of numbers. You can convert the data of society into numbers, and then you discover patterns in those numbers, which then map back to society. So, for example, there was a recent piece 2 years back, out of which our collaborators with us, with the Princeton Anthropology group, we had 3 meetings on this. We finally finished the last one, and that is actually on a particular paper. It began with a response to a particular paper. It was published by 2 American academics. It was by economists, and it was called Out of Africa. I mean, we've been referring to the papers Out of Africa. The basic argument in that paper is that poverty is genetic. Okay, it's quite fascinating. I mean, because if they come and say that to a social science department, you can imagine the response there will be when somebody comes and says, these 2 economists, well-known economists, will come and say poverty is genetic, which is, they were trying to suggest that being in a state of poverty, that is social state of being poverty, is somehow related to certain natural state of genetic diversity. Now, what happened is, and this was done, so we wanted to give a critique of that paper because we found it to be politically very dangerous paper too. And then you look at that paper, it's all about statistical methods. And how do they come to that conclusion? They come to the conclusion from converting statistics, that is large number description, into patterns of numbers. So it's patterns of numbers which are suggesting to them backwards that poverty is something to do with genetic diversity. Now, this is the about 10 or 12 group of people, anthropologists and sociologists, wrote a strong reply showing how false that particular paper was, but they didn't work on the part of the fact that the numbers artificially might have created a social situation. That is, by looking at a picture of numbers, you are saying something about a picture of society. That link is the deeply troubling link between using of numbers to talk about society. So, this idea of small numbers, large numbers, if you give it to that in talking about minorities, you're already being taken into that larger problem of large numbers which indicate patterns, and statistics is seen as law of large numbers. Small numbers resist. Small numbers don't allow you to do that. The problem with small numbers, like from any statistical methods, is that you can't, they're not big enough to show statistical patterns, and you don't know what to do with them. Small numbers is a problem, is a fundamental problem for sociology itself. So minority as a concept is also a fundamental problem, because if you look at sociology as this kind of a scientific ordering of society through numbers, I don't know how to handle these minority numbers. I wish there were more minorities than there are. But the moment there is minority becomes more, then they are no longer minorities. So this tension between this representation of numbers leads to one particular kind of a problem. The second question, the question about numbers also leads to, is a very interesting distinction. So what I'm doing, as I said, is by looking at these characteristics of minority, I want to show the properties which arise from that. The second very important point about the majority-minority is that because of this large number, small number question, it leads to questions of anonymity, an association of anonymity with majority, and an association of identity with minority. And this is really a product of the fact that it is a number distribution. Large numbers, or in a distribution of large numbers, individual numbers are anonymous. It's very difficult to mark parts of large distributions. It's far more easier to mark parts of smaller distributions. I mean, this you can understand in different ways, but basically what happens is, this majority-minority, because of this view, leads to 2 different meanings of majority-minority. Majority in terms of anonymity, and minority in terms of identity, which have very different implications for it. And therefore, this leads to what I call, in the context of majority, as a statistical social, which is majority is understood as a statistically distributed social, and a minority as a dimensional social. And there's a particular reason for it, I won't go into that here. But what I'm trying to point out is the nature of the social in the majority and minority are fundamentally different. In other words, the way we are we in a majority is different from the way you are a we in a minority. And that's very important, because how is it that you are a social? How do you belong? In other words, you could say the belongingness of you to a majority is very different from the relation of belongingness in a minority. And that, even if you give in to this large number, small number distribution, that is a very fundamental problem. Now, you can build on this because there's a lot of very interesting things you can build on. What is the nature of numbers in society? But I want to look at the next aspect of minority. So as I said, minority as numbers leads to one set of views. I want to look at minority as quality, because I want to look at how we use majority and minority as qualities of different things. Qualities, properties, very loosely, kinds of things which arise from looking at the context of majority and minority. The set of meanings which arise from that in the context, the domain of qualities would be the difference between the unity and multiplicity. So any invocation of the majority invokes some notion of the idea of unity, and the invocation of minority invokes the idea of multiplicity. And these are, obviously very interesting questions which have very deep implications. I'll give you one implication which I think is very central to this discourse on minorities. One is that while minorities are of small groups, small numbers, you can have many minorities. That is, minority by definition allow for multiplicity. So you'll have sexual minorities, ethnic minorities, social minorities, cultural minorities, religious minorities. Within them you can have 100 other different types of minorities. That is, minorities by definition are multiplicative. They become many. But on the other hand, there's only one majority. For a given situation where you have multiple minorities, it can be phrased dominantly with one majority. That is, majority resists being multiplicative and presents itself as unificatory, whereas minority by definition presents itself as multiplicative, as many. And this is a very interesting many-to-one problem which has very many different representations in philosophy and so on. Which also means, because of this, the way in which the minority and majority as values get presented, that is, what is the value of being a minority, right? And so looking at numbers and looking at what is the value of being a minority, value of being a majority. The second, as a consequence, the way the value of a majority which is presented is that of strength, and the minority is presented as weakness. Primarily because of this unity multiplicity issue, you have one majority presents a value of being. So if you ask the question, what do I mean by the notion of value here is, why would I want to be in a sense of majority? Why would you want to belong to the majority in a sense? So the majority minority breaks up the question of values into strength and weakness. And also something else which is very interesting, which is again I think very important in understanding the distinction of majority minority, which is the majority is then, the value of the majority is always as a potential aggressor, and the value of the minority is always as a potential victim. Now many minority studies work, especially looking at empirical studies on minorities, point to a very simple fact that minorities can and very often present themselves as victims. So the question in these analyses is, one, what some people call as active minorities, and this other as a victim minorities, which is, what is the tendency of a minority in its relationship with a majority? Is there a tendency to present itself as a victim? That is, that there have been certain things have been done to them by the majority and so on. Now what I want to point out is, both these notions of strength, which is a meaning for majority, and weakness and meaning for minority, please note that I'm saying these are the set of meanings which accrue to minority and majority, as well as the potential aggressor to potential victim, are what are used as a justification for this huge domain called minority rights. In fact, if there's any reason why people talk about minority today and its attendant problems, is because of the growth of this enormously humongous discipline called minority rights. And the EU has, the European Union has framed huge documents on minority rights and the way in which you process minority rights and so on, which has then become part of the world literature on minority rights everywhere. And there's really too much of work going on in that. Now, the point about that is the question of minority has been reduced to the question of minority rights, and that's one of the critique which many European scholars have made. The EU understanding of minority is now completely reduced to minority rights, not about any other understanding of what constitutes the minority and the majority relationship. And that is because the meanings of majority and minority as construed as potential aggressor, potential victim, and in the context of strength and weakness are really at the foundation of some move like this. And in terms of quality, something which is when Padre talks about fear of small numbers and he's saying fear of the minority, I want to break that up into two different parts. There is a sense of fear which is present in the majority, and there is also a sense of fear which is present in the very idea of minority. But the nature of the fear are very different. For the majority, the nature of fear, for the minority, it's very clear. The nature of fear includes of elimination, marginalization, non-representation, and so on. So that seemingly is very clear under the politics of majority-minority. But the fear of majority, and this, what Apadre calls as purification, which I don't really subscribe to, the fear of majority is actually a very deeply lurking fear of becoming a minority. And I'll just point out how that plays out in different ways, because there is something which is within the very definition of majority and minority, the recognition that majority is potentially the minority. So in other words, if you want to look at it in terms of how we understand, the fact that majority is potentially the other, the minority, is the constant source of problem in the majority understanding itself. And if you look at the way in which the sense of strength and unity and anonymity functions within the idea of majority, it is to negate the possibility of the devil within. You don't have to look at your enemies outside, basically, that's the point. Or if you call it, if you don't want to call it devil, it's too theological, the enemy within. That's all that there is to it, the problem of the majority here. Because within the definition of majority, there is this potentially the other issue, and therefore the question is, any formulation of minority hits too close at home before it hits others. So how does the majority engage with the possibility that it is always potentially a minority? And in fact, I think Apadre points out somewhere, but there have been many accounts of this. Even for example, from a study of Hinduism, the argument that Hinduism is constructed in different ways, even Ramla Thapa's own argument about the history of Hinduism and so on. The argument being that the Hindu construction becomes a majority construction in a very artificial sense. That the idea of Hinduism is itself deeply immersed in many minorities, and it is impossible unless there is a particular collective process of making it into a majority through various means, which includes Garv Apasi now. These are mechanisms by which you create a sense of a majority around what is in principle is not present itself as a majority. And that's a very deep argument, I think, about the formation of what constitutes the Hindu or the notions of identity around that. But that is a question I think we need to take into account, because the problem for them is going to be as much the problem of recognizing that Hinduism is nothing more than multiple minorities which somehow have to be unified or homogenized under one majority. Because you do not have anything within the practice of Hinduism or as textual traditions or as belief systems which will allow you to say that 60%, 70%, whatever, 50% is Hindus, unless you do something else to it. And that doing something else to it is this notions of majoritizing that religion, which is to create this notion that there is a homogeneity and unity to the different minorities within Hinduism. So, in other words, it's very possible, as one empirical work in this book called, forget the book, it's a collection of various scholars on empirical work on that. There is one person who talks about, I should have written that down, the name of the person. But anyway, he talks about empirical study of Muslims in North India, and he's pointing to one person who is telling him, he's recording these conversations, and one of these Muslim respondents is telling him, Muslims are not a minority. why do you even think Muslims are a minority? He says they are only next only to the Hindus. If you want to see these Hindus, a very large group. But he says we don't see us as minority. We are not minority because even in terms of numbers, he was saying that. I mean, that person's argument in that ethnographic account was, he was saying it's about 25% and the government always under-reports it. I mean, there's another set of things which goes on behind it. But what is interesting is the fact that the question of minority, if looked at it even in terms of these numbers or interpretation, in the context of Hinduism becomes a very big, deep problem. Unless you accept that there is a majoritizing influence of construction of Hinduism, it's very difficult to now define minorities in India vis-a-vis Hinduism as a major category. Okay, and that's and the reactions of this group of people who want this homogeneous Hinduism is all about responding to the fact that the potential enemy, that which they construct as the enemy is themselves, that they don't have to go out to do that. That's a very deeply troubling problem in the context of majority minority in India. Now, there are other ways of looking at this majority minority question. I will very briefly end with 2 or 3 more. You have the time. So I have a few. I look at some more different manifestations of majority minority in terms of cognition. So I was looking at it in terms of numbers, what are the implications? We look at majority minority as numbers. If we look at it as values, what are the implications? I want to look at certain kinds of notions of, you could call it as perception, worldviews, cognitions. The first major thing is about how the worldview of majority minority changed the way we understand social experiences. One, the majority understanding, the cognitive capacity of the majority are often encoded in the phrases of the universals. So I want to look at the universal particular, which is a very common understanding, for example, within philosophy, which is now very much part of social science talk. That is, there are ways of making sense of the world, one in terms of particular individuals, concrete objects, etc., etc., and another in terms of universals which are present across these concrete objects. So all particulars have many universals in them, and that's as I said, that is no longer part of philosophy. It's become so much a part of the vocabulary of social sciences. The question of the universals and particulars has very different set of meanings for the majority and minority. If you transplant this idea of universals and particulars, majority as universals and particulars as minorities, you get into very many interesting questions about it. One of which, of course, is this idea that the very act of naming is an act of particularity and it's an act of minority identity. That is, you can, as I said earlier, you can name minorities. You can say sexual minorities, ethnic minorities, social, within it you can say Muslim minorities, Christian minorities, etc., Buddhist minorities, and so on. But this idea that the idea of majority is universal and resists naming has very, different. I'm just showing you ways of looking and thinking through it, but drawing on different traditions. And so in other words, the implication as cognition is that you understand, you cognize the universal through the notion of sameness, and you cognize the idea of minority through the idea of difference. So these ideas of sameness and difference, which is again a very deep philosophical point of discussion, arise as cognitive ways of understanding through the perspective of the majority and the minority. So how it happens is that the majority, so the question about majority and minority in this sense is very interesting, which is, if you have something called majority, the point about majority is that many individuals under the majority have to be unified under the idea of majority. And the unification in majority is always through sameness. That is, the possibility of the we sociality of majority is through sameness. I belong to the majority in terms of my sameness, in terms of my commonalities with the others. I belong to the minority in terms of differences. And that's a very interesting logic which arises from that, which I'll come to in the end. That is, you are unified under the notion of difference in minorities. And that has very different implications than the way you are unified for majority, which are unified under the notion of sameness. So if it is not clear, maybe we'll make some comments about it later. But I want to point out that these are very different ways of coming together. So let me just emphasize this point, because this is the fundamental question we are working with, right? How is it that a group of individuals form a group? That's it. How is it that a set or a collection of 50 of us in this room, how do we become an identity? How do we become a social group, not just a sporadic collection of 50 people? If it is a majority imagination, you come together. The sociality happens through the process of recognition of sameness. I would say I'm an Indian, I'm a Hindu, I'm this, I'm that. Come together, the sociality happens through the invoking notions of sameness. For the coming together of the minority as minority, the dominant invocation is the idea of difference. And that's a very different way of understanding the word, right? So in other words, just to tell you the implications of it, it's like, let's say, a relationship between two people, and I understand the other person entirely in finding what is common between me and him, let us say, as against understanding the other person constantly with the differences between the two of us. I hope you see the important implications of it. That is, if I have a friend, and every time I talk to him, I'm only pointing out, we are both common, we share all these common things, that relationship is going to be very different. That sociality which we bind, if you like friendship, will be very different in character than another person with whom my only point of conversation is about the difference between the two of us. And that becomes the basis for our relationship. And if that is the basis of your relationship, the argument is that nature of coming together is fundamentally different. And we have to take this in account, because to understand the nature of the majority and the minority is to see how these different groups come under these signs of majority and minority, and the extremely important consequence of this through the relationship of sameness, discovering sameness, and then discovering difference which characterizes minority. And which also means there is a very important consequence to this, and that's again part of the thing as cognition, which is that majority as a concept, as an idea, through this invocation relationship of sameness, is fundamentally unstable. And minority, because of the relationship, the formation of the social through notion of difference, is relatively stable. It's the majority which is unstable as a fundamental presupposition. It's more unstable than the minority. And the reason why the majority then does what it does is to recapture the notion of stability to itself. So, to me that's, extremely important point, because part of the instability of the majority is also the earlier point I made in the context of values, which part of the instability is that within the majority are already minorities, and they just have to be acknowledged as such, then the majority will break up. And it is the same point which, as a cognitive terms in sameness and difference, which I want to point out, is that they lead to the fundamental consequence that majority in principle is more unstable than minority as a principle. Now, which means, which influences therefore very important consequences of the way we perceive majority minority. For example, I said about anonymity and identity, we can rephrase it in terms of cognition as invisibility and visibility. In fact, that's one of the most important problems of the minority question, the question of visibility, right? If a minority presents themselves visibly, so the whole debate on scarf in Europe and the dress codes in India and so on are all representation of this question. Being a majority, you are in sufficient anonymity, and anonymity allows you to do certain things, and you are sufficiently invisible in the formation of the social. In other words, my membership as a social majority is much weaker because I'm anonymous. I don't have to declare myself as who I am, this is my name, this is me, look at me, this is how I look. But a membership of a minority has in principle have to deal with the notion of identity and therefore visibility. And therefore, I think as Professor Poker might also talk about it, the rejection of the visibility or rejection of the signs of minority while being a minority is a deeply troubling problem for minority. Because the conceptualization of minority will begin with this notion of being out there, not hiding behind others, which the majority allows you to do. And the moment you are able to place the question of invisibility as a character of majority and visibility as a character of minority, then it raises today's most dominant discourse on minority is about visibility, that's all. If all the Muslims didn't look like Muslims, the problem would be solved. Part of the problem in India would be solved. The problem is you don't want to see them look different from you in the public space that you inhabit or you want to inhabit. And that is a problem. You're basically what you're saying is don't present yourself in a particular way. In other words, don't declare your non-anonymity in society. And to the majority which privileges anonymity, any social formation which resists this anonymity is dangerous. You're questioning my belongingness to my majority. I belong to the majority as an anonymous person. And then you question me that I am forced to declare myself out. You're going to make a minority of me within the majority. You see, the greatest danger to the idea of majority lies from this, identity and visibility. And so how do you respond to that? And therefore, if you take that along with the fact that in principle majority becomes unstable, it explains many of the ways in which the majority responds towards the idea of majority. Okay, then my last two categories are, this majority, minority as discourse. So that I'm looking at cognition, perception, etc. As discourse, it's a very interesting thing. I won't go more deeper into it, maybe we can talk about it later. As discourse, majority and minority create a completely different vocabulary. They create a completely new different language. The discourse on, especially the very complex invocations of justice principles and so on. But there are 2 points I will just talk from the context of as discourse, majority minority as discourse. One is the way they look at tradition. And I think there's another very interesting way in which the majority minority uses the idea of tradition. For majority, tradition becomes unification. And throughout the majority, the impulse of the majority is always about the sameness and unification and anonymity, etc. And the way in which tradition is invoked is as some form of unification. I mean, the best example is the response of the upper caste Hindus towards Dalits in this mobilization of Hindus today, the formation of a much larger Hindu, and of course now the various other things happening with the Garvapasi and so on. So tradition functions as a unification principle in majority, but tradition functions as protection in minority. I want to make a distinction to see how much we can push at the idea of tradition as shelter and tradition as protection, and why the question of tradition and therefore the symbols and therefore the question of visibility becomes very important. The question of visibility is very important because those signs of tradition are very differently used between the majority and minority. A majority does not need to use its tradition as protection. It doesn't have to invoke, present itself. I'm already protected as a majority. I don't have to declare myself and say I'm being protected by my tradition. You see, one of the simple consequences of this is this. Suppose somebody asks you, why are you dressed like this? Or why are you speaking like this? Or why are